What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button, and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
Braking system. In the braking system, the weakest place is the electric handbrake. More precisely, motor drives and wiring of the system. Otherwise, the brakes are as practical as possible. At the front, with discs with diameter of 313 and 321 mm calipers are the simplest, single piston with a floating bracket. With 385 mm discs calipers also with a floating bracket, but two piston. Such were supposed to cars with V8 engines and with a 3-liter compressor engine. The resource of these mechanisms is high, they are simple enough in repair, and in general, such brakes do not affect the price of car operation. Moreover, the resource of discs passes far beyond 100,000 kilometers. The Audi A6 has its own system, with 6-piston calipers and discs for 390 or 420 mm, and the 420 mm discs are ceramic. Each disc costs 1,200,000 rubles. I am not mistaken, 1,200,000. There is no speech about any economy, but I remind you, even in the stock version there are 580 horsepower, and these motors are tuned quite well, so you can't do without good brakes. On the rear axle everything is a little simpler. In any configuration there will be a single piston caliper with a floating bracket and a handbrake reducer. The discs are either 302 mm without ventilation, or 330 mm with ventilation in the versions more powerful. And only Audi A6 will have 356 mm discs, and they can be ceramic. The main problem with the braking system is the destruction of the gear motor housing. The early version of the system was characterized by low resource and regular appearance of cracks in the housing. As a result, the rear calipers suffered from corrosion, and the parking brake mechanism was frustrated by regular failures. If the problem was not eliminated in time, the caliper housing often collapsed in the area of the gland. Now the price of new non-original gearboxes is not large, and normal owners do not delay the repair. However, it would not hurt to check the parking brake performance in any case. The gear motor wiring on the cars before the restyling was also unreliable. The problems were mainly caused by low tightness of connectors. A minor feature of the braking system is the tendency of the rear calipers to knock due to wear on the guides and pins. It is sometimes difficult to find the cause of this knocking. ABS and sensors are very reliable, and problems with them are rare. Part original price of non-original 2 braking system front brake pads 11,683 8 6,941 Nakayama 225. Rear brake pads 12,433 8 5,560 Phoenix 1 446 brake disc front 314 by 25 9 355 Bosch 5 811 set 3 452 brake disc rear 302 by 12 7 555 8 6 199 Pagid 2 708 handbrake actuator 8 844 HDE 4 970 Brembo 22 200 suspension. Do not think that the main problem of Audi A6 suspensions is the multi-lever front axle. It is strong and lasts a long time. Moreover, the price of a set of levers for the usual versions of the car has recently been less than 15,000 rubles. And if dust covers are intact, then shock absorbers serve surprisingly long. From minuses, it is possible to note the steel bolts in an aluminum rotary knuckle. Especially suffer the mounts of the steering knuckle and upper arms, in particular their long tie bolt, often all ends with a gas torch, a welder and a drilling machine. So pay attention to the presence of welding marks on the front suspension knuckle. During such procedures, one lug is often simply broken off. Despite the fact that on this generation all levers are aluminum and with non-replaceable ball bearings, especially thrifty owners sometimes restore them using artisanal methods. It cannot be said that it always turns out to be reliable, so the suspension should be checked for economical repair. Cars are slowly approaching the threshold of replacing the original suspension for the second time. Factory sets usually served about 150 to 200,000 kilometers, and now many cars have mileage of about 250 to 300,000. And new owners save money by installing Chinese components or agreeing to artisanal repair. In the rear suspension, everything is much simpler. Almost all wearable silent blocks and ball, replaceable, straight small camber lever is cheap, and it is easier to replace it completely. The upper and lower cross arms are very expensive, but they will require replacement only if damaged by impact. The resource of such suspension is usually not less than 120 to 150,000 kilometers of mileage on normal roads. Separately, it is worth paying attention to the fact that subframe silent blocks on powerful versions of the A6 do not last longer than suspension elements, and it is necessary to check them too. The obvious disadvantage is a resource of hub bearings and knocking of supports of rear shock absorbers. Let me remind you, calipers at the back often knock, so that in services sometimes cannot find the correct cause of extraneous sound. The springs are not very reliable and tend to sag. This is often the cause of wear on the large, crooked, arm silent block in the front suspension. Broken coils of the springs are also found regularly. Air suspension on the A6 C6 became additional equipment for the top versions and not an accessory of the special version of the all-road, as it was on previous generations. And it should be said that the use of the second generation of air tanks has significantly increased the reliability of their work. Moisture separation has also become better, the system freezes less often. But compressor resource is also limited, and valve block may start to malfunction with time. Well and body level sensors also very often become the cause of system errors. However, in general, this air suspension of A6 C6 is more or less reliable. Besides, there are developments on repair of shock absorbers, recrimping of pneumatic hoses and replacement of compressor head. That allows to operate it relatively budgetary. Unfortunately, there is always a risk of breakdowns, and it is difficult to predict it. And the service at the first opportunity will rip off the owner like a sticky note, so you should apply for repairs strictly to specialized institutions, not to a general locksmith shop or even to a dealer. One original rack of the front axle in an assembly costs 500,000 rubles, or from 40,000 for the Chinese analog. If you are not ready to spend your time looking for special services and logistics, then any repair will be either very expensive or using spare parts with completely unpredictable service life and characteristics. The steering of the A6 C6 is very reliable. Both the usual rack and the rack with servotronic serve for a long time without suffering from knocks and leaks. The resource of pumps is usually about 300,000, but at mileage over 200,000 there is a risk of leaks and sucking of the system. And, of course, the resource is reduced by the fact that owners forget to change the oil in the system. In this case, the grid in the tank is clogged, and as a result, oil starvation, howling and heavy steering become inevitable. Transmission. General problems. Solid service life of ball joints, shafts and gearboxes in general allows not to care much about the condition of the transmission mechanics. But, unfortunately, internal tripods are too expensive, and in case of their failure you will have to choose non-original parts. The issue is relevant mainly for powerful cars, fans of quattro starts, and cars with mileage well over 300,000 kilometers. Mechanical boxes machines with mechanics are frankly few, nevertheless this big and prestigious car in Russia was usually bought with automatic transmission. But it is possible to buy A6 with automatic transmission. There are no problems with resource of boxes. However, 2-mass flywheels are expensive, and at high mileage on cars with powerful motors where of synchronizers of the second and third gears is quite possible. Sometimes there are worn bearings, but it happens much less often. It's funny that the majority of cars with automatic transmission in its time came off the assembly line with automatic, or more precisely, with variator, and mechanics on these cars is the result of welding after the failure of automatic transmission. So, in addition to boxes of GVC, GYF, GYX, JMC, FZJ or HVD series, which were put here serially in the A6 C6, you can meet the MCP from the old guard with mileage well over 500,000. The concern's boxes are reliable, but it is absolutely unknown what was put on the car and in what condition. Therefore, if such a replacement of the automatic transmission with an automatic transmission, carefully check what exactly was installed. Automatic transmissions, automatic gearboxes A6 C6 got quite a lot, and it is not easy to distinguish them. For front-wheel drive cars were intended in their own way unique variators, developed by Audi together with Luke, and for all-wheel Drive cars, automatic transmissions produced by ZF Series 6 HP of the first generation. There were several variators on Audi, and even in services they are often confused. At the same time, different variators with different codes were installed. By and large, there were only two variants of variators on A6 C6, VL 300 and VL 380, but they have many codes. Variator 01J, aka VL 300, was put with gasoline engines from 2.0 to 3.2 litres until the end of the model release, and with a 2-litre diesel until 2006. The list of its factory codes only for A6 would take up a page, but boxes GYZ, HJF, HJF, JQK, KTB, JWB and 24 other variants are all VL 300 in different form. They differ from each other by gear ratios, execution of control units for certain motors and year of manufacture. The design was continuously improved, each time fixing new and new faults. Starting with the 2006 model year, the 2.0 and 27-litre diesel engines were equipped with another variator, the 0AN series. It is also known as VL 380. It also has many codes, for example, HTH, JZE, JQG or KSY. This is the second generation of Audi variators, and despite the similarity in design, they don't have many parts in common. They are mostly shafts, cones and chain. There are a lot of rather ridiculous tales about variators VL 300, but in fact it is rather strong unit with a long resource. At the same time, the number of children's diseases is quite high. The design of Audi variator differs greatly from Jatco variators, which most people are used to. There is not a pushing belt, but a pulling chain. The design itself is intended for longitudinal installation instead of a torque converter. A starting friction package is used for starting, and the control unit could be called mechatronic, sensors and processor. With wiring, controlling solenoids are on a board mounted directly on the variator body. The most obvious complaint is the inability to tow a car with a variator. As a result, many people are afraid of even towing and almost moving the car in the service center. No, it is possible to roll it manually on a tow truck or on an elevator. But with towing there is really a difficulty. If the pump does not water the starter pack with oil, then the plates in it overheat instantly at fast rotation and it gets warped. It shorts the torque from the cones and the belt to the engine, and since there is no oil pressure, there is no tension on the chain either. As a result, it rotates immediately, erasing the working edges and scratching the surface of the cones. There is no neutral in the box. The double drum of the starting package provides both engagement of the rear gear and forward movement. So literally 5 minutes of towing with the engine off lead to the need to replace the main elements of the variator. During operation, lubrication of the starter pack is often disturbed due to malfunctions of the ejection pump. This is such element in which a small amount of oil with high pressure from the gearbox oil pump attracts a lot of oil from the crankcase and supplies lubrication without pressure to the friction pack. The design is technically very elegant, but the execution is poor. The plastic tubes wear out due to dirt in the oil, and over time the flow characteristics of the pump change. The plastic itself lasts about 5 years in hot oil, after which it becomes brittle. Afterwards, the structure can break simply on the spot. As a result, due to insufficient lubrication, the starter pack jerks the car at the beginning of the drive, especially when it starts uphill or starts moving after a long idling period. At the same time, friction wear increases significantly, possibly even warping due to overheating. Unfortunately, there is simply no means of diagnosing the operation of the ejector pump. Indirect control can be realized only by the degree of oil contamination. If there is an odor of burning oil or its darkening, it is necessary to change not only the oil, but also the pump, but it does not cost a cosmic sum. Now for it they ask about 12,000 rubles, and the minimum prices a year ago started from 7,000. True, for its replacement it will be necessary to remove and disassemble the box. Chains and cones are pleased with a fairly stable resource of 180 to 250,000 kilometers. They can serve less only in case of gross mistakes in the course of operation, but they will not work noticeably more, although in Europe there are cars with the original chain and mileage over 300,000. Problems with the starter pack and ejection pump are mostly secondary. They are either consequences of overheating, missed oil level, or simply extreme degree of oil contamination. But control unit failure is the most frequent malfunction of VL 300. The control unit stands directly on the box and heats up with it. As a result, failure of the control board and speed sensors is quite regular. And although sensors can be resoldered and damage to wiring and soldering can be repaired, control board failure is almost always expensive and difficult to repair. The reason is that variators have never been as common as DSG boxes or other automatic transmissions, and there aren't many specialists on them. Also, while the replacement boards are there, the prices aren't too low either, especially now. And if a couple of years ago the minimum prices for a serviceable second-hand board started from 15,000, maximum about 50,000 for second-hand or 80,000 rubles for a new block, now the prices for second-hand board move to the upper limit. And even higher, and new blocks are simply unavailable. It is a pity, but repair of the control unit is not always possible. Especially if it has been repaired before, there is damage to its base and the plastic is overheated. Or if, in addition to soldering violations, the contacts have problems with the elements on the board itself, under the layer of compound. They try to fix such failures, but it turns out to be extremely unreliable. Sometimes solenoids wear is also to blame for malfunctions, but in most cases they are replaced when replacing the ejection pump. Their life is approximately equal, and they wear out with the same problems with overheating and oil contamination. The cooling system is to blame for many of the box problems. At first glance, it is as simple as possible, a simple heat exchanger in the cold radiator tank, but in the pressure pipe there is a thermostat, which often jams. If you are unlucky, it jams in the closed position, and this leads to overheating. Variator VL 380 is optimized as much as possible, although the general scheme remains the same. At the same time, the design of the control board has been completely changed, which has become more reliable, and only sensor failures have remained among the typical problems. Although they are still part of the board, they are relatively easy to change. Well, the mechanical part works better due to the fact that under load the variator does not change gear ratios, but does it in steps, releasing the load when the cones move. You can read more about it in the material about A6 C7. The cooling system differs mainly. On A6 C6 it is made the same for VL 300 and VL 380, and unlike A6 C7, there are no heat exchangers on the box itself, which like to clog quickly. And, of course, the earlier box has more childhood diseases and, due to age, more solid mileage. There are no other complaints about it. There is no sense to tell again about the peculiarities of operation of ZF6 HP series boxes. ZF6 HP 19 version is installed on many cars. On Audi it was put with all motors, except for V10, with which 6 HP 26 worked. I have considered these boxes in detail in the material on Jaguar XF and in a piece on BMW. Once again I repeat that it is quite strong. From the point of view of mechanics, transmission, which can easily tolerate drifting, quattro starts and other races, 100 to 200, but due to the peculiarities of the system of locking RDT with a constant slip to compensate for torsional vibrations and a complex scheme of hydraulics with a massive wear elements such as rubber hydraulic accumulators and high temperature, the box is prone to leaks and wear of the hydraulic part. And the life of the GDT locking pads is relatively short. In the boxes before 2009, it often did not exceed 120 to 150,000 kilometers. Now these boxes are well mastered in repair and with regular oil change and temperature control, installation of new firmware and serviceable GDT serve reliably enough. But still it is necessary to remember that in time it will be necessary to change not only oil in them. All-wheel drive Audi's all-wheel drive is as usual excellent. Torsen in the center allows not to be afraid to overload clutches by starts, and passability with it is also not bad. In fact, there are no weak points of such scheme, and only with time consumption grows because of inevitable circulation of power at wear of differential and contamination of oil in it. The rear gearbox on the most powerful versions of the A6 may roll some people, but in most cases this will be an operational error. For example, sluggish wheels can suddenly hit a pavement with a high traction coefficient with full traction and at high speeds. Either the drives will fail or the gearbox will fail. Motors. General problems. All the specific features of Audi motors of the early 2000s on the A6 C6 in the form of a lot of quick release couplings in addition to the increased operating temperature and the mass introduction of direct injection and turbocharging, this was compounded by the high complexity of the engines and the dense layout. In combination with the appearance of aluminized blocks, this resulted in a sharp decrease in reliability and deterioration of the model's image. In fact, many problems were corrected only on the next generation of A6, and even then by the end of production. Gasoline engines. There are a lot of motors on this generation, but almost all of them I told in detail in materials about other German cars. A6 was equipped with a huge number of motors, and therefore today I will limit myself mainly to references. Some of the A6 C6's gasoline motors are exactly the same as in the all-road C5, the A8 D3 and the simple A6 C5. Thus, the motors 4 and 2 MPI, 335 horsepower series BAT and 3.0 MPI, 218 horsepower series BBJ families EA824 and EA835 on the A6 C6 are exactly the same. The first motor is very reliable, but the Alusil requires high-quality service. Dirty filters, oils and overheating easily lead to scoring. And the timing mechanism on the flywheel side is very complicated, and at mileage of about 180 to 200,000 it is necessary to change at least the upper chains, tensioners and calipers. And this is very expensive, both in parts and work. But at qualitative service the piston group has practically no wear, and the motor is deservedly considered to be a millionth. But only many of these motors are already laminated, because someone makes a mistake in maintenance for many years. BBJ motors are not aluminized, but have cast iron liners and more conventional phase controllers. It's a shame, but over time the liner can flake off the block, then antifreeze goes into the cylinders. This is quite a common problem for blocks more than 15 years old, and it is usually cured by rebushing or replacing the block. Nevertheless, BBJ motors in general have excellent life, and even if it is not quite a millionaire, it is close to it. I have considered 2 FSI motors with 350 horsepower of BVJ series of EA824 family in the review of Touareg of 2 generations, but I'll say something else. Lighter block, higher operating temperatures and direct injection have not improved the engine one bit. In addition to the cost and complexity of timing changes, there were a lot of added hassles. First, engines began to scuff and waste oil. Secondly, the cooling jacket of the lightweight block sometimes cracked. At the same time, this motor with direct injection is not much different from a conventional MPI motor in terms of economy, and the fuel equipment of the first generation has a short life and many other drawbacks, expressed in the form of poor cold start and low life of catalytic converters. 2-liter 4-cylinder motors with an output of 170 horsepower of BPJ and BYK series are variants of BPY and BWA motors from EA113 family, which I have considered in detail in the material on the Passat B6. Passat B6. The first TFSI engines were not entirely trouble-free. They can be remembered in the unsuccessful push rod of the fuel injector and caprices in the operation of the phase regulator and intershaft chain, and the timing mechanism, which was improved gradually. Its hydraulic tensioners were capricious and eventually they were abandoned. But all these shortcomings are not global, and for tuning possibilities, power and economy these motors can be forgiven a lot. They are definitely more successful than later motors of EA888 range and much cheaper in operation. You can read about 3.0 TFSI 290 horsepower motors of Kaja and CCAA series of AE837 family in the review A6 C7, so I won't add too much negativity here. This is indeed a very problematic line of motors, albeit with good tuning potential and outstanding fuel economy for such engines. But the scuffing of the Alusil block and the crudeness of the design made running an A6 with these motors a risky idea from the start. Even now that a solid portion of the baby problems are known, the Kaja and CCAA series motors remain one big problem. It is extremely rare that anyone refines them comprehensively. At best, the block will be gilded, but it is unknown where and how. The most common 2.4 to 3.2 liter V6s also belong to the EA837 family. All of these motors, except for the youngest 2.4 liter of the BDW series, are equipped with direct injection. The aluminized block in the mass segment turned out to be a real failure. Reliability problems were inherited even by the next generation. A6 C7 and on the C6, pouring FSI injectors, early failure of catalytic converters and a very complicated flywheel side timing seriously damaged the brand's reputation. Many buyers took atmospheric engines as a guarantor of simplicity and resource, remembering that on the C5 V6 engines were eternal. For this reason, after the loud success in Germany, sales quickly went down. In Russia, the manufacturer was insured and offered mainly 2, 4 MPI motors of this family, but instead of 2, 8 and 3, 2 engines 3, 0 MPI was offered, which turned out to be much more reliable, and the first 10 years did not cause any problems at all. About the price of V10 motors operation, probably it is not necessary to speak. Structurally, they do not differ much from the EA824 range, but their kinship with Lamborghini in itself raises the price of maintenance to near space. Our usual methods of assessing reliability and maintenance costs have little applicability to our S6s and cars over 500 horsepower. It is better to wait for the owners to tell us in comments how it is the case with maintenance of turbines, which are shoved even to the automatic transmission in the best traditions of 2.7 BES motors, and what is the life of the V10 piston group. Diesel engines. Diesel 2-liter motors of EA188 family with 16-valve cylinder head on A6 C6 are considered not the most successful diesels Volkswagen and Audi, but against the background of most of the gasoline engines and diesel V6, they can be called a model of resource, simplicity and reliability. And it does not reject the fact that they have problems with cracking of early cylinder heads, and the hexagon of oil pump drive should be necessarily changed at each replacement of timing to avoid serious troubles on all versions of this motor. On A6 with a block of balancer shafts, the hexagon does not withstand the load. Yes, and pump jets are considered more demanding to fuel and more expensive to maintain than common rail equipment on the next generation of engines. Sometimes, for a number of reasons, oil pressure in the cylinder head disappears. Sometimes the plugs fly out, and sometimes there is too much fuel in the oil. However, when the engine is serviced in a specialized service, all weak points will be checked and eliminated in advance. And from what cannot be eliminated, there will be only very moderate power and inherent high noisiness of these motors. The 3-liter diesel and its little brother, in the form of a 2.7-liter diesel from the EA896 family, I have already reviewed in great detail in the review of the VW Touareg, and the review of the A6 C7 pays attention to them. The motors are much more powerful, less vibration loaded than 2-liter motors, and quieter. But they are more expensive to run. Not least because the construction is relatively raw and much more complex. Typical problems of runaway 3-liter diesels are antifreeze leaks in the block, collapse, not very successful EGR, and a very complex and capricious timing mechanism installed on the flywheel side. With all this, provided good maintenance, the motor is quite reliable up to the mileage of 250 to 300,000. And its piston group can last many times more. But it is not cheap in service and requires a very high culture of work and the use of original spare parts. It will respond to any liberties with breakdowns. In this respect, it is, we can say, capricious. The injectors do not like bad diesel fuel, the cylinder head, bad antifreeze, turbines and piston group, bad filters. Taking into account the falling price of cars of this generation, maintenance of such diesels on a full program becomes a great rarity, and the car with them is less profitable than with some motor 3.0 MPI or 2.0 TFSI. To take or not to take? Yes, Audi A6 C6 is a comfortable and not bad car, but, unfortunately, it can no longer be considered an indicator of any status. It is not the right age. There is no sense to spend huge money on its maintenance unless, of course, you are not a fan of the brand. And, most likely, if you are looking for this car, you should give preference to cars with 2-liter diesel or gasoline engines with 2, 0 and 3, 0 MPI motors, which are at least not so expensive to maintain. Competitions with other motors, strongly on an amateur, there is a lot of money, the status is not enough. And be sure to look for a service familiar with the subtleties of maintenance of these cars, otherwise you will have to spend money in thick bundles, and you will be able to drive only on big church holidays. Especially if the previous owners gave up on the maintenance of the car several years ago. In conclusion, the Audi A6 C6 presents a fascinating case study in automotive engineering, showcasing both the brilliance and the pitfalls of modern design. While the impressive brake disc may seem like a $1 million feature, the reality of numerous engine issues can overshadow its appeal. For potential buyers, it's crucial to weigh these factors carefully. Understanding the balance between performance and reliability can make all the difference in your ownership experience. Thank you for watching, and be sure to stay informed as you navigate the world of luxury vehicles.